Thanks for watching Spooky South Coast, and be sure to click the subscribe button and enable notifications with the bell icon to stay up to date with future videos.
But why over the next 4.5 months does he go on a killing spree and kill 10 other women? It doesn't make any sense.
We're talking about women, at least the victims that are commonly believed to be the victims of this highway serial killer. These are women who are, have drug problems, who are known to frequent bars, who are kind of involved with kind of the seedy underbelly of the city at the time. And there's a lot of questions coming from the chat room, people asking, were all of these victims killed in the same way? Was there similarities in the way that they were attacked and the way that they were murdered from victim to victim?
What they were able to determine based on autopsies and examination of the bodies, because the women had been out there for such a long period of time, they were only able to come up with a definitive cause of death in 2 of the victims. 2 of the victims were strangled. The other ones, they believe, most likely had been strangled, but that was not positively determined based on the condition of their remains.
Just to echo something that Maureen talked about earlier, and this is something that we had seen through searching the old newspaper archives, it was a record-setting heat in the summer of 1988, and you can see that in the newspaper articles at the time when we're researching the highway murders right alongside, and the headlines are record-setting heat. And just as an example, Nancy Piva disappeared on July 7th, 1988. She was found just 3 weeks later on July 30th, and in that short 3-week time period, she decomposed to almost pretty much skeletal remains. I mean, there was some soft tissue there, but I mean so think about that. She's only out there for 3 weeks and decomposes that quickly. Where you have a victim like Robin Rhodes, who was out there for almost a year, or Sandra Patello, who was almost out there for a year. Think about how badly decomposed those women probably were when compared to Nancy Piva, who was only out there for 3 weeks. I mean, and a lot of these women were found with no clothes whatsoever, some partially clad, some with different items. But for a woman that's out there with no clothing, that's been out there for that long, there's not going to be a lot of evidence left. It's
not like they're buried in, no offense to the book title, Maureen, with shallow graves, but these women are just basically, in many cases, just dumped there, just left there.
Yes, exactly.
So we're talking about, being exposed to not only the elements, but also, and no disrespect to the victims, but you've got animals out there, you've got predators, you've got you're victims to the circumstances as well as to these murders as well, and that's putting the investigators behind the 8 ball even further.
We've been lucky enough to track down 4 direct eyewitnesses to finding remains for our series. And in all of the instances, these eyewitnesses would say, oh, there was the not to be graphic, but the skull and the rib cage, but the hands and feet were missing, or there were bones missing, or the things weren't found where you usually would think they would be found, because yes, animal predation unfortunately is a thing when coyotes and scavengers and
they can make off with those parts. And
we interviewed Bob St. Jean, who was the head of the CPAC unit out of Ron Pina's office at the time, and
just before we go, Bob St. Jean is the investigator, the DA's investigator. Before you start getting angry phone calls from retired state troopers,
sure.
Bob St. Jean was had been a state trooper, and then became the chief investigator in Ron Pina's office. He was not in charge of CPAC. That's just one of those things to save all the angry callers.
No, yeah, I misspoke. I misspoke there. The chief, he was technical. He was titled as chief investigator when I would see it in the news. But anyway, he said, basically that these crime scenes were very scattered. They weren't compact crime scenes because of the time that had elapsed.
And these victims were chosen based on, it seems like, on opportunity more than anything else. There was no compelling pattern that would draw the killer from one to the other. I mean, there was no distinguishing feature. It wasn't like they were all blondes. It wasn't like they all had a certain figure. I mean, these were just kind of crimes of opportunity. Does that seem accurate, Maureen?
Well, all of them were short. All but one were extremely thin. All but one were all white. They did have very similar looks, similar profiles. Not all, but pretty much. There was a lot of similarities in their appearances in that regard.
The ages were pretty varied, though. I mean, Christina Montero was 19, and Nancy was, 36? Nancy Paiva, 36. So, I mean, there was quite a gap in the ages.
Yeah.
So, and of course, we've discovered that, I should say we, but Maureen, and when your work, when you were covering the case, and the investigators were investigating the case, and Aaron going back and looking through the lens of, 20-plus years later when you started investigating it, they did run in some similar circles. Some of these women were known to each other.
Yes. But that's not that unusual. You're talking about a fairly small city where people know each other. I liken it to people in the news media know other people in the news media. Doctors know doctors, nurses know nurses, teachers know teachers. This is a city where there's very large families. People grow up in the New Bedford area and they stay put. People put down very strong roots in the community. And in the drug community, that is also a very, very tight-knit community. People know each other. So that they'd be running in the same circles, they would know the same people. So it's not that unusual that they would know each other. Drug addicts would crash at each other's homes. The women would share clothing. So as a result, they may also all have known, they could have all known the killer.
Right. And I kind of do want to get into some of that discussion, too, about, because there were... there's so much to cover, and there's so much to go through. And let me just say that for anybody who is listening to the show, watching the show on YouTube, absolutely pick up a copy of Shallow Graves. You can get it from Amazon, wherever books are sold. Stay tuned to thehighwaymurders.com, right? That's the website,
Highwaymurders.com, yep.
So that you can see the trailers, which will run coming up in a little bit, but you can also keep up to date with when everything's coming out, because there's so much to absorb and to learn about this case that we're never going to be able to cover it all in the time that we have left tonight. But kind of fast forwarding a little bit, this case is clearly developing into something that is more than just a few random acts. This is something that's starting to look like a pattern, something that's starting to come together. And Maureen, I know that at the time you were speaking on a regular basis with the district attorney at the time, Ron Pina, and a lot of people who are looking back on this case through the lens of time and hindsight are looking at him as being somebody who is just a in some ways, some people look at him as a character of folly. In some ways, other people look at him as somebody who wasn't doing everything that he could have done. He had his own circumstances in his own life that were questionable and weird. What was your dealing like with the district attorney at the time of these murders?
Ron Pina was very media savvy. He was very television savvy. My dealings, I dealt with him quite often. Quite frankly, he was not a big fan of the local media. He was much more enamored of the Boston media than New Bedford radio or New Bedford print, or let's say the very local television news. His sites were much more on Boston and the Boston press. At least that was my experience. I firmly do believe that said that he did want to solve the case. It was not, and he, I think he truly did believe that he was going after the right person in the case. Kenneth Pont, who was a city attorney, was eventually indicted for one of the murders. I do believe that he thought that was the right decision, but I don't think he was looking at the case clear enough and looking at the evidence clear enough, because that case if it went to trial, never would have moved forward.
And Aaron, I know you've been critical of Ron Pena, and let me throw this out there, Aaron. I think we can't talk about him without at least mentioning his own circumstances, because
I you know, it's not so much. We've interviewed quite a few people for this documentary, and yes, he does catch his fair share of criticism from some of the people that we've interviewed. I think, to echo what Maureen just said, one of the most interesting interviews that we shot for the documentary was Kenneth Pont's second defense attorney, Kevin Reddington, who was one of the most premier defense attorneys in the state of Massachusetts. And he had a very, very funny quote when we asked him. Kevin Reddington really wanted that to go to trial. And his quote was, "If that went to trial, I would have beaten it like a redheaded stepchild." And that was his quote. And he was dead on about that. There is no way a jury would have convicted Kenneth Pont based on the evidence that the district attorney had at the time. There's no way.
So how did Kenneth Pont come to...
I have to agree with Aaron there, because there was really absolutely no evidence against Ken Pont that would warrant a conviction.
I think with Kenneth Pont, I think one of the things that if you were having a serial killing expert look at this case, the main criticism of Kenneth Pont as a suspect would be one of the primary reasons he was looked at is there was an incident where he was charged with an assault back in early April of 1988, and one of the eventual victims, Rochelle Clifford, was with him during this alleged assault. Fast forward to when Kenneth Pont's indicted in 1990. The district attorney at the indictment said that Rochelle Clifford was going to testify against Kenneth Pont in this assault case, and that Kenneth Pont had killed her to keep her quiet. Now, right then and there, you're attributing a motive to somebody killing another person, when by and large, serial killers do not have a motive. So it would have been difficult to extrapolate that and say, well, okay, he kills Rochelle to keep her quiet, but why over the next 4.5 months does he go on a killing spree and kill 10 other women? It doesn't make any sense. Right. That was, I think, the major problem with the theory that Kenneth Pont was responsible for these murders.